Think of the following simple case. Suppose you see two elderly ladies coming out of the theater, and from their animated conversation, you catch the word wicked. Of course, you would automatically assume that the ladies thoroughly disapproved of the performance. But if behind the two ladies there were two teenage girls, and one said to the other, wicked, you would probably interpret her mood very differently. According to the Merriam-Webster online dictionary, this wicked functions as an adjective which denotes something which is disgustingly unpleasant or causing or likely to cause harm, distress, or trouble, whereas this wicked functions either as an adjective which denotes something which is going beyond reasonable or predictable limits, or an adverb which functions as an intensifier. Now, this whole scene just described is an excerpt from Guy Deutscher's famous book, The Unfolding of Language. This book was written in English. In the Hebrew edition of his book, Deutscher replaced this wicked with it's a pity on time, denoting it's a waste of time, and this wicked with it's a pity on time, this time denoting extremely cool, wonderful, or great. Let's see how it's a pity on time is used in colloquial Hebrew speech. Listen, Charlize hasn't won an Oscar for her part for nothing. She plays It's a Pity on Time there. This is an It's a Pity on Time movie. If you haven't watched it yet, you should do it right away. The movie is based, so I take it, on a real story, but it's a pity on time, terrifying. In example 1, it's a pity on time functions as a manner adverb, modifying the verb plays, and denoting wonderfully. In example 2, it functions as an adjective, modifying the noun movie, and denoting wonderful. And in example 3, it is an intensifier, modifying the adjective terrifying, and denoting very. Wonderfully, wonderful, and very are all modifiers. They are all evaluative. Importantly, this is not just a change of meaning, but also a change of grammatical status. Whereas the original It's a Pity on Time is a complete sentence, the new It's a Pity on Time, exemplified here, are intrasentential elements. They are words. And this whole thing is an instance of lexicalization. This particular phenomenon of It's a Pity on Time, a complete sentence undergoing lexicalization, has attracted unusual attention among Hebrew speakers and intrigued linguists focusing on Hebrew linguistics because it seems rare. And it intrigued me too, and I was curious to know whether this phenomenon tallies with the principles of lexicalization, and if so, could it be predicted? I was also curious to know why it is rare in Hebrew and cross-linguistically. And the first thing I found was that it is indeed rare in Hebrew and cross-linguistically, but less than it seems. In fact, I detected 6 more cases of complete sentences undergoing lexicalization, similar to It's a Pity on Time, but the other complete sentences enjoyed far less public attention than It's a Pity on Time. Here they are. It's a pity on words. It feels like crying or dying. It's possible to go crazy or to die. There is nothing to say. There are no such words. There are no such things. And I could see right away that all of them belong to the same family, for all of them are thetic prepositions. Thetic prepositions in Hebrew are predicate-first sentences, where a predicate is followed by an optional dative participant, followed by an additional element, which could be a noun phrase, a prepositional phrase, or an infinitive. And the full version of this structure is the one which contains the dative participant. However, all members of the family of complete sentences that have lexicalized are the dativeless variants of thetic prepositions in Hebrew. The constructional model I adopted in order to explain what makes those sentences, the only sentences in Hebrew, to undergo this process, and why this process is so rare, is the model which is based on the distinction between two types of prepositions: categorical prepositions and thetic prepositions. The categorical preposition, which is an informationally bipartite structure, consists of a focal portion, also known as rim or comment, and a non-focal portion, also known as theme or topic. The thetic preposition is an informationally monopartite structure, where the entire preposition functions as a unit, which constitutes the focal information. This model, which makes a distinction between these two types of prepositions, is not only able to handle a linguistic change of the sentence rather than on the word or phrase level, but it is also able to take into account the discourse function of the changing linguistic unit when embedded in context. After all, a linguistic change always takes place in context. And now we move to the analysis. We all know that lexicalization consists of two steps. The first step is a semantic change of the given linguistic sequence, and the second step, which hinges on the first one, is a change of grammatical status. I argue that in order for the first step to take place, the linguistic material undergoing a semantic change must constitute an interpretatively cohesive unit. I also argue that in order for a change of grammatical status to take place, here a sentence becoming an intrasentential element, a word, linguistic material undergoing change must be semantically incomplete. And given the constructional distinction between categorical and thetic prepositions, I further argue that only thetic prepositions, not categorical prepositions, meet these two criteria. We start with the first step of lexicalization, the semantic change. We know that lexicalization is a process which occurs within the boundaries of the phrase, as opposed to grammaticalization, which is cross-phrasal. And indeed, all the examples I detected in the literature about lexicalization are newly formed words originating from phrases. Noun phrases, verb phrases, adjective phrases, and prepositional phrases. And this is not quite surprising, for we know that phrases have a psychological reality, which means that speakers are sensitive to phrase boundaries. Phrases form processing units made of smaller units, that is, phrases. And the words within the phrase are more relevant to each other than to other words outside the phrase. Verb phrases make a prominent category among phrases which become words. Evidence supportive of this argument focused on the asymmetry between verb-object combinations, that is, verb phrases, and subject-verb combinations in terms of semantic opacity. There are hardly any idiomatic combinations of subject-verb, whereas there are plenty of idiomatic combinations of verb-object, that is, verb phrases, in Hebrew and cross-linguistically. And these data indicate that the verb phrase is an interpretatively cohesive unit. This interpretative cohesion motivates its high tendency to become opaque. This very interpretative cohesion also manifests in specific configurations of thetic prepositions, those which lack a dative participant. I'll analyze the bonding between the predicate and the following element in dativeless thetic prepositions, showing that they all form verb phrase-like units and as such are prone to undergo a semantic change. For now, I ignore the dative participant. I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. So, I divided the set of sentences into 3 different categories according to the element following the predicate: a noun phrase, a prepositional phrase, and an infinitive. I start with the predicate "there's no," followed by noun phrases. Traditionally, a noun following a predicate in thetic prepositions in Hebrew is considered the subject of the sentence. And prescriptive Hebrew grammarians would very much like to see speakers use these noun phrases marked for the nominative case when following the predicate. But the rebellious speakers want to have it their way, and there's a large body of evidence showing that they treat this post-predicative noun as a direct object by marking it for the accusative case with the particle et. In fact, the rebellious speakers reject this form, the normative form, altogether. This is what Lambrecht termed subject-object neutralization. I searched Hebrew 1010 corpus in Sketch Engine for instances of the predicate "there's no," followed by the specific so-called noun phrase subject in those specific sentences when marked for the accusative case with the particle et. I detected such 160 instances indicating that Hebrew speakers construe those specific so-called noun phrase subjects in those specific sentences as direct objects. Those direct object-like noun phrases form verb phrase-like units together with the preceding predicate "there's no," and quite like true verb phrases, those thetic verb phrase-like units are expected to be prone to undergo a semantic change. Now, what about the sentences "it's a pity on time" and "it's a pity on words"? This combination of a predicate and a prepositional phrase is a simpler case than the previous one. A predicate and a prepositional phrase are definitely a verb phrase. Although not a verb-direct-object combination, it's still a more cohesive unit than a subject-verb combination. And again, quite like true verb phrases, those thetic verb phrase-like units are expected to be prone to undergo a semantic change. In the last category, a predicate followed by an infinitive. The syntactic status of the infinitive in thetic prepositions has triggered a lively debate among linguists who study modern Hebrew. Is it a subject or not? This debate still goes on, and opinions remain deeply divided. Browsing through the relevant literature, I learned that the same debate has a long tradition in Russian linguistics. Although typologically remote from Hebrew, Russian had an enormous impact on the revived Hebrew, and in particular on the form and usage of thetic prepositions in Hebrew. And it is not inconceivable that what we have here is a Russian construction produced with Hebrew words. I found that Divyak and Yanda showed that this sequence, a predicate followed by a dative participant and an infinitive, is shared by two constructions. The one in which the infinitive is indeed the subject of the sentence, and the other in which the predicate and the infinitive form a tightly bound unit, where the infinitive is the semantic core and the predicate just modifies it. In order to show that there are indeed two constructions, Divyak and Yanda ran elicitation and judgment experiments, which I replicated in Hebrew, and found that though specific, it feels like crying or dying, and it's possible to go crazy or to die, in Hebrew behave exactly like what Divyak and Yanda call a complex event, a kind of a complex verb, an infinitive which is the semantic core, and a predicate which modifies it, a verb phrase like unit. And again, quite like true verb phrases, those verb phrases like units are prone to undergo a semantic change. So what do we have here? We have 7 sentences, thetic prepositions, each of which functions like a verb phrase. As such, each of which is an interpretatively cohesive unit, prone to undergo a semantic change. Now, why do these sentences must be dativeless in order to undergo the semantic change? If we look again at Russian linguistic facts, we see that cases in Russian are ordered on a scale of agentivity. On the left, most agentive end of the scale, one can note the nominative immediately followed by the dative case. Given that agentivity is a characteristic of subjects, the dative participant can serve as a demoted subject. And Mo and Patel recently raised the possibility that this is the case in Hebrew too. This fact that the dative participant can be considered a demoted subject can alter the two-way distinction between categorical prepositions and thetic prepositions. I suggest instead a three-way distinction. On the left hand, a categorical preposition with a nominative subject, and then a thetic preposition with a subject in the form of a dative participant. And finally, on the right hand, a thetic preposition lacking a subject altogether. So instead of this two-way distinction, I suggest this three-way distinction. Only thetic prepositions without a dative participant are truly monopartite, and as such they form an interpretatively cohesive unit, which is prone to a semantic change to become semantically opaque. And now we move to the second step of lexicalization, the change of grammatical status. This step requires that the sequence undergoing change will be semantically incomplete. In order to examine this step of lexicalization, we need to examine the role of evaluative thetic prepositions in text and the interrelationship between them and categorical prepositions. Well, that's how a narrative text looks like. Categorical prepositions form the aboutness chain of the storyline of this narrative. And every once in a while we encounter a thetic preposition. Relevant to my study are evaluative thetic prepositions. The function of evaluative thetic prepositions is to evaluate material in the preceding discourse. In other words, thetic prepositions are semantically incomplete. They are comments, they are rhetoric, They are in search for a theme residing in prior discourse. The rhetoric, it's a pity on time, and the like are flexible modifiers. Given that in Hebrew, modifiers follow the modified element, the newly formed semantically opaque units can easily squeeze into the very previous sentence. When the flexible modifier follows a verb, it functions like an adverb. When it follows a noun, it functions like an adjective. And when it follows an adjective, it functions like an intensifier. We here have a change of grammatical status. So, I hope that I convinced you that this lexicalization process is indeed all about the construction, here, the sentential construction. The complete sentences undergoing lexicalization are dativeless evaluative thetic prepositions, which are not much different than verb phrases. Both are monopartite and rhetoric. Monopartition enables the semantic change. Being rhetoric motivates the change of grammatical status. This phenomenon indeed tallies with the principles of lexicalization, and it could be predicted in advance. It is relatively rare because we are dealing with thetic prepositions, which are propositions of the non-canonical type, which are evaluative and dativeless, thus constituting a rather small fraction of all possible sentences in Hebrew, and possibly cross-linguistically. Thank you.